Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Michelle and today I'm going to be talking to ENFPs out there and to anybody who is close to an ENFP or trying to get close to an ENFP to understand a certain weakness that we have, and for those who are ENFPs, how to work against said weakness. Now, I'm no expert, I still deal with this weakness, which is part of why I'm bringing it up today. We're going to talk about the weakness of fantasization that ENFPs have. Now, there are plenty of times when having fantasies are good, and there are also times when it's not appropriate to fantasize about certain things. And so throughout this video, I'm going to describe one, why that's happening, and two, what you can do about it as an ENFP or somebody who is friends with an ENFP, how you could help them out. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So first of all, what do I mean by fantasization? That's a rather broad term. Everybody has fantasies, do they not? What particularly am I talking about? Well, in order to demonstrate this the best I can, let's bring it back to the high school or even middle school version of me. As a young girl, I was highly and overtly romantic. I had these romantic ideas that I would find the one, and that, I would just know that they're the one, and I would have all these feelings for them, and blah, 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 blah. Standard idealist problems. Those feelings manifested as fantasies towards the people around me. In high school, I'm going to admit, I had a little bit of an obsession with one person in particular. And for a good part of my life, I thought that I was truly in love with this person. Now, looking back, I know that I was just purely infatuated, and I let this fantasy play out a little too much in my head, and I let it build up a little bit too much. What happened was I met this guy. Right away, I had a crush on him. Okay, I've had crushes on plenty of people. Crushes happen easily, especially, at least in my opinion, especially for ENFPs. I think it's very easy for us to crush on people because we see the potential with that person, and it's hard not to crush on somebody if you find them cute and you see potential. Alas, I got a crush on him. Okay. Then I ended up starting to talk to him privately via chat, and I started to realize that we had a lot in common. That only deepened the fantasy. So at first it was just a crush. It was just this genuine feeling of attraction to this other person, that I wanted to be closer to them, etc. Getting to know them and getting to know that we had things in common deepened that feeling and increased the fantasization. And when I fantasized, I didn't necessarily imagine an entire life together. I did, however, imagine being near them, having close encounters with them, being able to express my feelings, having these hugely romantic moments. I think part of it is from watching movies, where they are hyper romanticized, and it's like said that any good relationship has these like wild feelings of like passion and such. And so I had visions of that kind of stuff with him. And in general, I started to convince myself that he was the one. And it built and built and built. Here's the thing. I never took time to ask him how he felt. And when he did express how he felt, I ignored it. And I said, that's an obstacle that we can overcome, because if it's true love, we can overcome said obstacle. Flash forward to the present. I still have fantasies like these. Maybe not always romantic fantasies, but if a situation happens, I will immediately think of ways that I can handle said situation. I will go through a million different possibilities of how it could play out, and obviously I'm going to spend the most time on the one that's the most interesting. But when I meet people who have things that I want, and I have any kind of mild attraction to them, a crush is formed. And then fantasization happens, where I fantasize about, following through on those feelings, following through and just dropping everything in my current life and going after that, because extroverted intuition loves the possibility of something new, of some change. I think that this fantasization is something that a lot of ENFPs experience, and without proper consequences, ENFPs will act upon these fantasies. ENFPs will go after these fantasies without much regard for what the other person is feeling, without much regard for how it will impact a lot of other people. We just kind of go for it because it's new, it's exciting, we want it, it feels right. There's a lot of the world is conspiring to make this happen feeling that comes when you're an ENFP. Because as an ENFP, you want a lot of things, right? And when you find something that has a lot of the things that you want, along with something romantic, maybe not, but if you find something that has a lot of what you want, even if it's not the right thing, you're going to be convinced that it is the right thing because it feels right. This is where, as an ENFP, we have that extroverted intuition. We love those possibilities. Our introverted feeling is not as developed because we don't spend time developing it. So when we have so many things that we feel good about, we don't recognize the difference between feels good and feels right. In my last video, which I will link up there, I talked about how to develop introverted feeling and how introverted feeling is all about figuring out what feels good and what feels right and doing what feels right to try to act upon that what feels right. Well, with extroverted intuition as our lead, a lot of things feel right and a lot of things feel good, and it's hard a lot of times to be able to tell the difference. Most ENFPs haven't spent time recognizing that this is happening and just follow through with these fantasies and follow through with these desires because there's not a self-check in place. So in the next part of my video, I'm going to break down how an ENFP can work on these fantasies and help become a little bit more realistic and a little bit less changeable, movable, inspired by these fantasies, because fantasies are all well and good. You know, I like a good fantasy myself, that's why I write, but just because a fantasy feels good doesn't mean that you need to act on it. And so let's kind of go over how an ENFP can overcome these fantasies. ENFPs have low introverted logic. We have low introverted sensing, and we ignore our introverted intuition. So with the three things being kind of suppressed that would help prevent us from following through with these fantasizations, we don't have a lot of checks and balance there to help prevent it from happening. ENFPs, listen up. The first thing that you need to do in order to stop following through with these fantasies, in order to stop being a floozy or whatever it is that you think that's happening because of these fantasies, first and foremost is recognize when you are fantasizing. Recognize when you are letting those thoughts carry you, when you are letting those thoughts take over, when you are letting these fantasies take over the majority of your mind. This last weekend, I have been experiencing a fantasy, and in the past, a lot of times I would just really lean into it because it felt good to follow into this fantasy. It felt good to kind of imagine what could come if I followed this fantasy, but taking a real look at what's happening and why it's happening. This is the only way to stop a fantasy in its tracks, is to recognize that it is a fantasy. Now, I know you don't want to give up on the fantasy because as an ENFP, closing off an opportunity is worse than just about anything else. That is one of the worst feelings, is to have an opportunity close. So I'm not saying give up the fantasy. What I'm saying is recognize it for what it is. Look at it and be able to label it as a fantasy. Okay, so you found out that it's a fantasy, you've labeled it as a fantasy. What do you do next? Next, you think about the consequences. First and foremost, how is this situation that you're thinking of possibly capable of hurting the other person? I know that you've already thought of all the ways that it's going to benefit the person. Believe me, I know. You've thought many, many times about how this fantasy of yours can benefit the other person, but have you thought about how it could hurt the other person? What negative consequences this fantasy could have on that person. What could go wrong? I'm not saying get down in the dumps, think about everything that could go wrong and hurt yourself. I'm saying take a good, hard, honest look at what could go wrong and how it could hurt the other person if you follow through on this fantasy. Or if there's no other person involved, if this is not a romantic fantasy, think about how this is going to hurt yourself. I have fantasized many times about things that they seem like a really good idea, but when I think about it and I recognize the consequences, it's actually going to hurt me a lot more than it's going to help me. And it has a lot more potential for harm. And it's important to look at the negative consequences. We're all ENFPs, you know. You are good at looking at the positive consequences. But you have to think about the negative consequences. Think about how this situation, this fantasy, has happened or played out in the past. This is another way to recognize the problems, but also to recognize how the pattern of this fantasization is happening. What about this situation has caused you to fantasize? What about this situation is like other fantasies that you've come up with? Why are you fantasizing right now? What does it have that you want? And how can you get what you want without following through on this fantasy? Now, ENFPs have a little bit of a reputation of jumping from relationship to relationship to relationship. And I personally feel that the ENFP is doing this because they are following through with those fantasies over and over and over and over again. There's no checks in place. So as an ENFP, yes, you might be able to see what's wrong with your current situation. However, think about how this fantasy is going to go wrong, how it could go wrong. What is actually going to happen if you follow through with this fantasy? And also, what is this fantasy telling you that you want? What is this fantasy showing you about your desires that you're trying to put all into this change? Friends of ENFPs, how can you help an ENFP who's stuck in a fantasy? First and foremost, help them be realistic, help them see the negative consequences. Now here's the thing, I myself am victim to this, where somebody with the voice of reason comes in and is like, this is how that's going to play out. I'm going to be like, yeah, it could play out that way, but it could also play out like this. So something that you can do to help an ENFP is not only to give the one possible negative consequence. I'm talking mostly to people who use NI. They're very good at a singular negative consequence, the most likely. Give us a few negative consequences, a few potential negative consequences. That will help tremendously, because the one, we can brush that off easily. If we see multiple possibilities of ways that it could go wrong, we're much more likely to take it seriously. The other thing that you can do is help call out the fantasy. Yo, you're fantasizing right now. That's not realistic. Dude, stop. And we're not going to be very open to it at first because we're like, I want to fantasize. But the thing is, those fantasies can really take over and we need a little bit of a voice of reason. So even if that ENFP gets a little annoyed with you, even if they're like, don't tell me that, I don't want to know. Tell us that. We need to know. We don't want to know. We need to know. With that, I want to ask you guys, you ENFPs who are watching, do you fantasize a lot? Have you followed through with those fantasies? Are you someone who's learned how to manage the fantasies? And if so, what have you done to help stop yourself from fantasizing? What advice would you give to another ENFP to stop this negative habit? And if you're somebody who is not an ENFP, have you experienced ENFPs doing this? Have you been able to successfully call out an ENFP and help them stop from a fantasy? And how did you do that? Do you think it's important for ENFPs to stop fantasies? Give me your thoughts. I want to hear your guys' thoughts. I want the comment section to be an area of discord, an area of place where you can talk to one another, get each other's feedback, because honestly, that's what the comment sections are for. I really enjoy reading the comments. I'm sorry if I don't always respond. I don't always have anything to add to what you've said, but I do read all the comments. I really enjoy reading your comments and what you have to say and what you think, and that helps me to get a better understanding of myself and others. So please continue to do that. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. I want to take a moment real fast to thank my new Patreons. This week I have added 2 Patreons to what one of them has called my Michi, which I like that. It's pretty cool. We have Ben Fournier, or Benevolent Cytocorum. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's how it looked like you pronounced it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, in the comments, feel free. And then we have Micro, the ISTJ. If you are interested in joining my Patreon, the link will be down in the description below. You can get 24-hour early access to any of my videos. You can get access to additional content. It's a pretty cool place. I'm trying to build that up, so if you wanna join, that's great. Thank you. And with that, have a beautiful, amazing, fantastic day. Bye.